Magesa belonged to a particular generation of African theologians and scholars who insist on giving the church in Africa an African face, an African voice, an African imagination, and an African vision and praxis of being authentically human in the world. Thank you very much, Dr. Magoti. I appreciate the introductions. And also thank you for reminding us of how to keep the memory of Dr. Magesa alive. Thanks for that. I've titled my lecture today, The Future of African Theology, Continuing the Legacy of Laurenti Magesa. First of all, I thank the members of the Pan-African Catholic Theology and Pastoral Network, PACTPAN, for inviting me to give the inaugural Professor Laurenti Magesa Memorial Lecture. It is truly an honor on my part because of how influential Magesa was to my own career as a theologian. You have invited me to reflect on the contours of the future of African theology. To achieve this goal, this lecture will be based on 3 reflective movements that are themselves relevant for the theological imagination that ought to be going on in Africa today. First, it is important to reclaim a healthy understanding of the role of a theologian and her place in the life of the Catholic Church. The second movement will offer a decolonial critique of Africa and its collective imagination. It will attempt to unpack the vestiges of colonial trauma, as well as the possibilities for progress that are unfolding in the continent. The final movement will offer ways African theologians can make this era a moment of saturated grace, of new possibilities and imaginations that will help to further the voice of Africa in the ecclesial, political, social, economic, and cultural discourses. In each of the movements, I will attempt to retrieve the voice and witness of Magesa to show how he embodied a healthy way of doing theology, especially within the continent of Africa. So I titled the first movement, The Role of a Theologian in the Church Towards a Pneumatological Summons. The debate over the question of who should teach in the Catholic Church is not a new one. In fact, one can argue that it is tied to all theologies in the Church, whether that of the sacraments, soteriology, Christology, pneumatology, and ecclesiology. Why is this the case? To understand this question, one has to return to the basics of Christianity. The Gospels offer us a glimpse at how to address this question. So reading the Johannine account on the appearance of the risen Christ to Mary of Magdala, one notices that 2 things occur in the account in John chapter 20, verses 11 to 18. First, the risen Christ reveals the founding truth of what his entire mission was meant to be, that God who became one with creation and who was killed has risen from the dead. In other words, death can no longer have the last word in the destiny of all that God created. Second, that belief in this truth is also a summon to become an announcer of this good news. In other words, to become a follower of the risen Christ, one must also embrace the evangelizing or teaching role in the world and amongst the community of believers. So the foundation of the theological vocation is baptism. To be a follower of Christ is to take seriously the role of being a teacher. However beautiful this statement may sound, one has to ask the question, what is the content of theology, or how can the content of faith as received by the church be passed on? In response to this question, I offer the following. All revelation is interpretation. Revelation is God speaking or encountering creation in the concreteness of their existence. However, the content of what is spoken can only be assessed through the mediation of interpretation. Interpretation is thus the praxis of reception, which is at the heart of how revelation becomes relevant to each epoch in human history. Note, this does not mean that reception is to be understood as something static or what people will call semper idem. like an archival material deposited in some religious storage. No, revelation is itself dynamic in the sense that it is a living revelation. By this, I mean the encounter we have with the divine is always a continuum. This continuum is mediated or received through the rituals of discernment in reception. Reception makes legitimate the work of the Spirit in responding to the signs of the times. Without this response, reception will itself be understood as colonizing. Stated differently, reception is an active process that is conditioned by a pneumatological turn to the signs of the times, and to see within the realities around one, or within and without the church, the dynamic application of what has been received on the realities playing out in the respective context of the faith community. Furthermore, from a Christological point of view, even the gift of the incarnation is itself an interpretation. God becoming one with creation is how God receives creation, and also how creation responds to the invitation to be one with God, a process that God first initiates. So the incarnation is thus not just a truth about the work of God in creation. It is also how God has centered both reception and interpretation as modes of encountering God. Stated differently, this movement of God revealing God's self to creation allows for a hermeneutic praxis that one can say is possible when we understand the incarnation not as an event in a particular moment in history. Rather, it is an event that is unfolding throughout history. This unfolding process plays itself out within different contexts in a manner that the different contexts play a role in how the event is embraced, understood, and applied. There is never one approach fits all contexts. This is the issue at stake today in the theological world. Some think that context does not matter. Reception is what makes context matter and also validates context as the authentic place and way that revelation is mediated or epiphanized. In other words, revelation, insofar as it is epiphanic, is always an interpretation within the domain of reception. What is spoken by God must always be received. And it is in the process of reception that interpretation becomes the pneumatological tool for making the content of revelation a living content that speaks to the concrete context of the community receiving it. Without interpretation, understood as reception, revelation itself will not be accessible because interpretation makes valid and relevant the realities shaping a people's social, cultural, religious, and political contexts. At this point, it is important to address the following question. How can revelation be justified if its reception and meaning to community is conditioned by the praxis and rituals of interpretation? So to address this question clearly, one has to unpack the different movements inherent in the process of reception. The place of ecclesial awareness of what theologically is referred to as sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful, is important in this process. Justification of revelation, or in this case, the interpretative reception, is grounded in ecclesial discernment, or what is ordinarily known as ecclesial infallibility. Ecclesial infallibility is expressed through the sensus fidelium, in a manner that the Patriarch office becomes a tool for serving and making visible the koinonia or fellowship of churches that revelation invokes in the followers of Christ, but which must also be contextualized. In other words, the contextualization of revelation is what brings about the fellowship of the churches and the witness to the living nature of God's revelation that offers contextual responses to the needs of a particular church. Does this mean that the Patriarch office is not necessary? The simple answer is no. However, the Patriarch office is not intended to blur the contextual nuances playing out in each epoch or context. This, again, is at the heart of the debate between those who argue that dogma must be understood as having one meaning in a literal manner, and those who argue that dogma is but an attempt to shed light on the vast boundaries in which the nuances of the hermeneutic reception of a truth play out and is to be received. So the patron office, in its infallible role in matters dealing with faith and morals, does not invent dogmas or truths. Rather, its teachings originate organically from the praxis of truths playing out already in the church. In this case, the sense of the faithful within the church is the fountain from which the patron office draws its insights from. In other words, the patron office does not turn its gaze away from the sensus fidelium when it is articulating a dogmatic teaching. Rather, it turns its gaze towards the sensus fidelium because it is there that the patron office finds its validation, purpose, relevance, and the content of what it teaches definitively. Pay attention to the following term definitively. It is not to be understood as always the same. Rather, it simply means that light has been shown on a matter to allow for people to see the nuanced boundaries shaping the matter. Furthermore, the sensus fidelium is itself constituted by nuances and differences that become sources of filiality among the faithful and their respective episcopal expressions of the one church of Christ. I am not conflating the church militant with the church suffering and the church triumphant by using the term one church of Christ. There is a distinction between all three, but they are all united in the oneness of the church, who is Christ itself. I intend to hold that distinction in place as I explicate the issues I am addressing. Since the sensus fidelium is constituted by difference, then the patron office is itself oriented to hold in place the nuances and differences that constitute the church that is both one and many. When the patron office ignores these two movements in the church, one and many, we see problems in the church. For example, I believe this is what Pope Francis is attempting to do in his papacy. He is trying to hold both in place and thus address the problem that occurs when there is an imbalance. On the other hand, he is working to accentuate the oneness of the church, and on the other, on one hand, is doing that, and on the other hand, he is insisting on upholding the particularities of the respective churches. He is not the first to attempt to do this. While he seems to be succeeding, that cannot be said always of other previous attempts. For example, an attempt was made in the 19th century at the height of the debate between the Ultramontanists and the Gallicanists on where authority ultimately lies in the church. In fact, the debate can be said to have originated during the conciliary struggles that began in the 12th century among canonists on the limits of papal authority. The eventual resolution adopted by the First Vatican Council tended to tilt its perspective towards the oneness of the Catholic Church, the Ultramontanist position, in its definition of papal infallibility, without much attention given to the many contexts that make up the church. This failure on the part of the First Vatican Council to address context, clearly the Gallicanist position, led to the unfortunate schism that saw the establishment of the Old Catholic Church, or what we call the Union of Utrecht. Vatican II Council attempted to do what the previous council was unable to accomplish. It reclaimed the teaching office of the episcopacy in union with the Bishop of Rome, and grounded all teaching in the organic reality of the Catholic Church's teaching ministry in fidelity to Christ, who is the utmost teacher and in whom truth is incarnated. However, one can argue that the Second Vatican Council only succeeded in doing so theoretically, but has not been able to do so in a ritualized manner within the daily life of the Catholic Church. So ecclesial infallibility bounds all members of the church in the ritual space of teaching the faith to all within and outside the church. Unfortunately, some in the church tend to understand this reality of ecclesial infallibility to manifest only within the ministerial priesthood. I recall a homily given during a chrism mass by a bishop in Nigeria some years ago while I was still living there, stating that the concept of church does not apply to all persons within it, but solely to the bishops in and from whom the laity and ordained clergy derive their identity as members of the ecclesial reality. If I may state categorically, he is incorrect. He might be reading Wrongly, Ignatius of Antioch's letter to the Smyrnians that was more about addressing issues that came up in the church of Smyrna in Asia and not about the Catholic Church in its totality. Baptism is what grants all and gives all their identities as members of the church. It is also what generates the possibility to embrace the teaching ministry that all Christians are called to embody in word and action. I am not denying the fact that there are different ministries in the church. Rather, I am arguing the following. All ministries embody the different markers of the ministry of Christ: priest, teacher, and servant, because of how baptism embodies and transmits these markers. So one has to ask this question: why is this misunderstanding still prevalent in the church, where the laity or some members of the church are seen as passive members without a teaching ministry? I argue that the scandal surrounding conciliarism in the 15th century is still holding the consciousness of the church hostage. It took centuries to undo the power of conciliarism in the governance of the Latin church, and many are afraid to go along that road again. I will say that the fear is based on a lack of rich imagination and creativity on the part of those engaged in the conversation or ecclesial governance. No one wants to be accused of heresy in an attempt to rethink the one and the many models and figure out how to hold both in place through the way the link plays out among the following: ecclesial infallibility, sensus fidelium, papal, conciliar, and episcopal infallibility, also reception as interpretation. So to help address this issue, one has to pay close attention to the role of the theologian in the church. The theologian's fundamental role in the church is to be a reflective witness to reading the signs of the times in a pneumatological manner that allows for the church to respond accordingly to what God is inviting it to embody. This was exactly what Mary of Magdala did along with the followers of Christ who responded to the signs of the times playing out at their own historical epoch. Even the content of faith itself is within the ritual space of reading the signs of the times. Stated differently, the theologian helps in the ritual of reception to shed light on what the church ought to do in its collective response to discipleship. Consequently, the work of the theologian allows for the revelatory encounter of God with creation to be a living encounter. This is because the theologian helps the church to reflect on how God's truth is dynamic in a manner that it becomes relevant for each epoch and context. Remember, dynamism or relevance does not equate to sameness. Dynamism or relevance speaks to the fact that the people of God are constantly on a journey with God to allow for them to embrace a God who speaks always in the present to creation. In light of this fact, one has to look closely at how a particular theologian, Magesa, embodies this practice of reading the signs of the times in a manner that allows for both church and society to be more attuned to an ethical consciousness. In a monograph titled "The Church and Liberation in Africa" that was published in 1976, Magesa, in fidelity to his vocation as a theologian within the context of the church in Africa, argued for a church that is truly attuned to the realities holding the continent captive. A turn to liberation that unpacks the centrality of abundant life is central to Magesa's vision of church. In this work, Magesa plants his theological feet in an ecclesiology that will lead to multiple discourses on how to address the multiple colonialities that hold Africa's social, economic, political, cultural, and religious imaginations captive. Like the good theologian that he is, Magesa refuses to settle for a church that has become an instrument of colonialism and cultural violence, as produced by the matrix of colonial traumas. Magesa belonged to a particular generation of African theologians and scholars who insist on giving the church in Africa an African face, an African voice, an African imagination, and an African vision and praxis of being authentically human in the world. Here I am conscious of such scholars as Jean-Marc Ila, Elochukwu Eugene Uzuko, Mercy Amba Oduyoye, Teresa Mbari Hinga, John S. Mbiti, and many more. So authentic liberation must be rooted in a healthy sense of self. Hence, Magesa dedicated some of his works like African Religion, The Moral Traditions of Abundant Life, that was published in 1997, Anatomy of Inculturation, Transforming the Church in Africa, published 2004, Rethinking Mission, Evangelization in Africa in a New Era, 2006, African Religion in the Dialogue Debate, From Intolerance to Coexistence, 2010, What is Not Sacred, African Spirituality, 2013, and The Post-Conciliar Church in Africa, Not Turning Back the Clock, 2016. In each of these works, Magesa sheds light on what Africa has to offer, not just to the world, but to the church as well. Too often, Africa is presented in the global psyche as a continent with deficiencies, a continent that is in dire need of salvation, whether secular or religious. It is also a continent that has been exploited for its people and natural resources as well. Cognizant of the realities defining the continent, Magesa insists that liberation must be grounded in a turn to the rich spiritualities that Africans have produced over the centuries. As a prophetic response to the savior complex mentality that defined how many Western missionaries and secular agents have encountered Africa and its people over the centuries, Magesa sheds light on the relevance of African cosmos-focused vision of the human person in relation with God and other beings by insisting that to exist authentically, one must necessarily center life as a relational phenomenon that binds all beings together, whether spiritual or material. In his words, the imperative of community and harmony that determines the ethical agenda of life in African religion deeply concerns the ancestors. By their character and attributes, they link the individuals in a clan and the visible and invisible worlds. To be a human being, to be a moral, ethical person, Umtu in Kiswahili and Muntu in nearly all other Bantu languages with slight phonetic variations, is not possible to live in isolation. So community is a central motif in the works of Magesa. Again and again, he links community to the African consciousness of life that is mediated, sustained, and protected by the ancestors themselves, who serve as the media of the actualization of resurrection for Africans. For Africans, as Magesa continued to argue in his works, belief in abundant life transcends the boundaries of one religion. It is as African as it can get. In fact, community that is rooted in an ethical consciousness of abundant life for all is what Magesa argues to be at the core of African spirituality. By doing this, Magesa insists that spirituality is a relevant tool for addressing the ills that Africa and its people face. In a world where secularism has become the modus vivendi for many, and where a turn to the sacred is frowned upon, Magesa argues for the retrieval of a way of being in the world that is not narcissistic, one that makes room for all to feel welcome and validated. Typical of his African roots, Magesa sees the human person as a being radically oriented towards otherness. In other words, to be authentically human, one has to live with a consciousness of the well-being of the other and the praxis that instantiates that consciousness in concrete acts of kindness, support, and validation of the other, each being living for the other. So the work of a theologian is to stand at the crossroads of time as it plays out in the life of church and society. By this, I mean a theologian, while reading the signs of the times, ought to ask the question, what is God telling us today as we inherit the past? And how can our consciousness of today allow us to embrace the future that is unfolding? This orientation allows the theologian not to settle for the fleeting comfort of the present or the nostalgic memory of the past. The future must be embraced as a possibility of surprises and creative opportunities for all. Magesa was cognizant of this positionality that the theologian ought to embrace. Hence, in his work, Anatomy of Inculturation, Transforming the Church in Africa, he dedicated an entire section unpacking what and how the future is unfolding in the context of the continent. Such themes as human freedom, the models of church that ought to be embraced by the African Christians, forms of political institutions that serve the common good, spiritualities that center the care of the environment, ways to address poverty and the crisis of HIV/AIDS, and the embrace of Africa's cultural diversities as means for embracing a vision of oneness as expressed in the acts and policies that foster the common good, were relevant to a future that Magesa dreamed and worked for as a theologian working and living in the African context. So in the next section of this lecture, I intend to shed light on some of the current issues that face the continent of Africa with the intent to argue for a theological vision of church and society in the continent that allows for constructive theological stance by those who do theologies that are relevant to the continent. So I'll call the next movement, Understanding Africa's Colonial Traumas. Post-colonial Africa suffers from unresolved traumas from its colonial past. Key factors shape contemporary African societies. Some of them include a fragmentation of memories of Africa's rich past, the complete disregard for life, whether that of humans or the environment, an epidemic of corruption and individualism that caricatures any attempt to have an organized society that is oriented towards the common good, and an erasure of people's identities that is facilitated by religious, tribal, ethnic, and linguistic fundamentalism. It is important that I unpack some of these to help shed light on why and how contemporary theologies that are being done in the continent can help birth forth a new Africa. To legitimize colonialism, the colonial matrix produces a culture of forgetfulness in its intended victims. It does this by a strategic delegitimization of the cultures, political systems, rituals of knowledge production, religious heritage, and linguistic abilities of the people. It then introduces the cultures, along with the political systems, rituals of knowledge production, religious traditions, and languages of the colonizer into the world of the colonized. So colonialism employs violence in all its expressions to achieve its goals. Africans remember too well how they were introduced into the world of the West through the barrel of the gun, along with the subtle use of soft power by agents of the West as well. By soft power, I mean the introduction of Western ways of life, religious traditions, and even a sense of self. Assimilation with a hierarchy of being human is always the intended goal. On one hand, the colonizer argues for an embrace of their own way of life as a means of attaining a civilized existence. On the other hand, they employ a hierarchy of being human that makes the one being assimilated to be less human in comparison to the one who controls the assimilation process. So the entire French assimilation process legitimizes this claim. In 1840, the French political thinker, Alexis de Tocqueville, after embarking on a finding mission to Algeria, argued that, and I quote, Algerians could not be perfectly assimilated into the French world because of their Islamic identity, polygamous culture, nomadic way of life, and thus portrayed as lazy, unquote. So the same assimilation process created a hierarchy of authentic humanity based on religious affiliation. To be authentically French, one had to be a Christian. Religion that is meant to help foster a sense of authentic humanity for all gradually became a source of division and negation of the other. The intended goal of colonialism is to produce in the colonized a fragmentation of memory that produces and also legitimizes a form of coloniality of imagination. And by coloniality of imagination, I mean that a system that operates by creating in the subject an erasure of memories of the past that do not meet the logic of the new realities being experienced by the subject. After all, colonialism has legitimacy by always negating the histories, cultures, social systems, and economies of the people being colonized. So the colonizer has a legitimacy in the places traditionally occupied by the colonized only by showing how the colonized is existentially dependent on the benevolence of the colonizer. So consequently, the fact that the process of being a civilized people meant that Africans ought to embrace the European vision of civilization through the cohesion of the barrel of the gun, as well as accept the ideology of race that makes the European more human than Africans. So the agenda of coloniality of imagination allows for the embrace of another form of coloniality, which is coloniality of knowledge. This coloniality of knowledge is intended to erase an African consciousness and praxis of knowledge production, to allow for that of Europe to claim legitimacy within the African psyche. This form of coloniality never allows for an embrace of complexities or paradoxes. Either you are an African or you are assimilated into the European world. To be African is to be an enemy of the state, of religion, of language, of culture, and of the economic systems produced for the assimilated Africans. In this case, violence is itself a legitimate response towards anyone who insists on being authentically African. This is where it becomes tricky, because the systems produced by colonialism are such that they never allow for authentic freedom to be realized. Thus, anyone who wants to embody authentic freedom is pushed to the peripheries of society, religion, culture, politics, and even language. One may be quick to say that Africa now experiences authentic freedom. This is where the grand self-deception plays itself out. No African nation, except Tanzania, under the late Julius Nyerere, attempted to address the traumas of colonialism on the African psyche after the end of the former praxis of colonialism in the continent. As a result of the failure of Africans to do the needed work of addressing their collective traumas through an embrace of coloniality of imagination, Africans are today perpetuating a culture of violence towards each other. The ancient praxis of palaver that was used to address differences have been forgotten and abandoned by Africans. An average African can only remember the recent past. And when they do, they think that what they remember is truly ancient. Unfortunately, it is not. What they remember is what coloniality of knowledge and the hijacked memories of their people by the colonial matrix has constructed for them. Even this lecture that I am giving is itself held captive by the linguistic colonialism. Language is the home of coloniality of imagination. To speak the language of the colonizer is to embody a split in one's psyche. Ngugi wa Thiong'o states this well when he writes, and I quote him, "Colonial alienation takes two interlinked forms, an active or passive distancing of oneself from the reality around, and an active or passive identification with that which is most external to one's environment. It starts with a deliberate disassociation of the language of conceptualization, of thinking, of formal education, of mental development from the language of daily interactions in the home and in the community. It is like separating the mind from the body so that they are occupying two unrelated linguistic spheres in the same person. On a larger social scale, it is like producing a society of bodiless heads and headless bodies," unquote. Furthermore, language is not just about communication. It is the home of identity construction. It is the home of meaning production. It is the home of forming community. When language is weaponized as a colonial tool for control, its victims will always be a people who replicate violence and all the intended pathologies that are coded in it by the colonizer. When Africans speak the language of the colonizers, they replicate erasures of themselves and project violence towards each other. Suspicions, unhealthy competitions, and even a hierarchy of being are legitimized just by the usage of the language of the colonizers. Africans look at themselves and define each other's humanity based on how their mastery of the colonizers' languages is expressed. Africans forget the memory. That memory is coded in language. Not to speak one's cultural language is to lose one's sense of cultural, religious, political, and economic rootedness. In fact, it is to lose one's sense of self because, and here I'm quoting Ludwig Wittgenstein, because the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, unquote. A sense of self is never complete unless it is rooted in a rich memory of the past, on which one's historicity finds its roots. It is also incomplete unless the imagination is able to wander into a future that is unfolding. This fact can also be applied to a society and a people. An African sense of self can correctly be said to be suffering from what Ethelbert Umweg calls anthropological poverty. Such form of poverty limits a people's ability to connect to their rich historical past, whether in the domain of knowledge production, anthropological expressions, language, culture, and even the imaginative abilities that need to be rooted in the past, while looking into the unfolding future. This fragmentation of the collective and individual psyche of Africans that produces an anemia of a sense of history is deeply rooted in the matrix of colonialism. In fact, colonialism produces not just an anemia of memory, it also produces a form of collective humanity that is intended to be at the service of the colonizer. It is a collective humanity that is deeply rooted in the positionality of servitude and self-negation. Such a humanity thinks and speaks of history only from the locus of linearity, and it is unable to hold in place the complexities defining a healthy historicity. At the core of the vision of the human that colonialism produced in Africa is a preference of a form of simplicity that is injurious to the psyche of both the individual and community. Such injurious simplicity defined the new reality of nation states in Africa. Africa was forced to abandon the rainbow tapestry of political institutions, languages, cultures, ways of thinking, and knowledge production, and ways of expressing gender and sexual identities. The colonized African living in the colonial vision of society is meant to embody injurious linearities all the way. To turn to the complex is to become an enemy of the grand agenda for Africans by the benefactors and perpetrators of colonialism. Magesa understood the relevance of reclaiming Africa's collective sense of self. Hence, he stressed the importance of reclaiming Africa's spirituality through a strategic dialogue with Africa's religious heritage. For Magesa, spirituality is not simply about praying. Rather, it is also about doing and acting in the world. Hence, he defines African spirituality as an orientation towards harmony, community, and ways of living in a world defined by religious and cultural diversities. If Africa is to embrace peace and harmony among the different ethnic groups that make up the colonial realities called nation states, then a turn to African spiritual consciousness ought to be the norm and way forward. Courage and insightfulness are virtues that Africans need today if they are to articulate a new way of being in the world. Magesa insists on these virtues when he sheds light on how and what evangelization ought to produce in contemporary African psyche. Too often, Africans have been conditioned by the colonial matrix that produces in them a mentality of subserviency. Reception of Christianity or Islam has been reduced to a rejection of Africa's religious and cultural identity markers. To be a Christian has been equated to being westernized. To be a Muslim has been equated to be Arabized. Authentic African Christianity seems to be foreign to many Africans, except those who continue to embody the Coptic traditions either in North Africa or those in Ethiopia and Eritrea. African Christianity simply means the beating of drums. As it's playing out today, simply means the beating of drums, wearing of African clothing, and singing songs written in African languages. However, the psyches of African Christians are still colonized psyches that instantiate all things Western or East Asian or Arabic. It is on that note that Magesa insists on rethinking mission and identity in contemporary Africa in several of his works, including one titled Rethinking Mission, Evangelization in Africa in a New Era. So the way forward for Africa cannot be left to secular agents alone. Religion has a place in a healthy Africa. In fact, theologians must take their places at the table of reimagining an Africa that is healthy. It is on that note that I now want to turn to the final part of this lecture by demonstrating some ways theologians can continue the vision of Magesa that are grounded in a theological boldness and willingness to be radically imaginative. And I call this last movement Glimpses of Hope, Reclaiming a Healthy Vision of Church and Society in Africa. Good theology must be grounded in a turn to radical hope. Hope itself is not about wishful thinking or grounded in fantasy. Rather, hope is oriented towards the prophetic. It makes legitimate a vision of the future that allows for authentic progress to be the norm. It is not about a nostalgia for the past. Theology is not about a retrieval of the past only. Rather, it is about linking the past to the present while furthering the present into the many possibilities that open into the future. Too often, theologies being done by some scholars have been reduced to the level of apologetics to defend theological insights of the past. Or at best, some theologians see themselves as doctrinal police officers. They are more interested in repeating clearly what has been articulated by others in the past that the church eventually embraced as its guide for responding authentically to the divine human encounter. They forget that theology is a living discipline that requires the imaginative abilities of the theologian to expand the pathways of encounter with the God who has become a neighbor with creation. The fact that theology ought to speak to and from the context of a people is why there is really nothing like universal theology. All theology is contextual. Thus, since each context is dynamic, theologies done in such contexts must themselves be dynamic. Magesa understood this principle of contextual theology very well when he wrote from his social location. As an African, he understood the importance of tapping into the memories, metaphors, and cultural heritage of Africa. Permit me to share an intimate encounter I had with Magesa. In 2013, I was one of the theologians from Africa invited to the Jesuit Ekima University College in Nairobi, Kenya, to reflect on the articulation of pastoral and theological pathways for a healthy church and society in Africa. Magesa and I were both panelists tasked with unpacking the role and place of African women in the Catholic Church in Africa. Being a young theologian myself who was just about to defend his doctoral dissertation, I was honored to be at the same table with such a renowned scholar. Magesa tapped into the rich heritage of Africa's matriarchal systems that the colonialists intentionally suppressed in order to replicate Western social systems in Africa as a way of legitimizing their colonial presence and agenda in the continent. After our presentation together, I intentionally forged an intellectual friendship with him. I was lucky that I did that. Through his insightful mentorship, I became drawn to taking seriously the intellectual heritage of our African past. Because of his mentorship, I was able to introduce a course in comparative theology that focused on the study of African religion in dialogue with African Christianity and African Islam. a course that has become one of my favorite courses as I introduce the rich intellectual, cultural, and religious heritage of Africa to my Western students in a predominantly white institution. The future of theology in Africa must be rooted in an embrace of decolonial imaginations. Africa was intentionally conditioned to reject itself in all its heritages, be they religious, cultural, epistemic, economic, and social. To reclaim what was erased by colonialism and to instantiate what is being reclaimed in the present in a manner that allows for a healthy future to be birthed, theology must be done in a manner that does not follow the logic of the colonizer. Colonial logic is intended to subjugate the psyche of the one who appropriates it. A turn to decolonial imagination is embodied in a prophetic witness. It is saturated with creativity. African theology must be rooted in creative thinking. By this, I mean that African theologians ought to do theology outside of the sometimes toxic understanding of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy does not mean rigid uniformity. Rather, it is grounded in the practice of synodality, where all parties are involved in the discerning process of making sense of beliefs that instantiate the word of God as a living tradition. For God's word to be a living word, it must be received in a manner that allows for the pruning of its hermeneutic content to help address the context and realities of the community during the reception. Let me offer a helpful example here. The early church embarked on addressing some theological issues of its day, and in doing this, it appropriated the linguistic imaginations of that era, of the cultures of its era, to help articulate such doctrines related to the Trinity. So the linguistic imaginations of that era are now outdated. Doing theology that is relevant for Africa today entails the furthering of the imaginative process to allow for the usage of concepts, metaphors, and symbols that help Africans to see Christian truths as organically rooted in their own respective cultures and linguistic heritages. Latin is not the spoken language of Africa. Western languages can go so far in Africa's ability to contextualize theological truths. To ensure that the roots are deep, the future of theology in the continent must take seriously Africa's linguistic imaginations. The same can be said of liturgical praxis in the continent. Why can't Africa articulate its own rites and not be dependent on the Roman rite? The Roman rite originated from a particular context, Imperial Rome. It speaks to the cultural imaginations of Rome. There is nothing wrong with this fact, but Africa is not Rome, and Rome is not Africa. On that note, let me invoke the critical observation of the late Jean-Marc Hillard, and I quote him: "Restoration of community bonds with the invisible world is one of the fundamental tasks of that African Christianity, which Paul VI launched in Kampala. However, good ideas and logical doctrines are no longer sufficient. They must be incorporated into theology, catechesis, and liturgy." The Second Vatican Council opened up the possibility for young churches to explore liturgical and theological pluralism, which allows us to try certain experiments which could be fruitful for all Christianity. Why should the mountain people of northern Cameroon break their prayers only to see them replaced by Christian relics on altars? If they find that the prayer is superstition that must be rejected to enter the church, won't the mountain people make the same judgment about the use of relics? In the mountains, the prayer of the Father is respected in In African churches, the bones of some unknown person placed on the altar stone appear to be a kind of fetish. Since traditionally, there can be no prayer to the ancestors without the object which represents them, why shouldn't African Christians be permitted to bring the prayer to a gathering in memory of the ancestors? Unquote. A last question forces contemporary African theologians to take seriously their creative abilities to help retrieve Africa's sacred heritage as the locus of God's encounter with its people. To refuse to engage this question of his and thus appeal to the rigid understanding of tradition as semper idem is to capitulate to the anemic imagination that colonial trauma is intended to produce in the psyches of the colonized. Theology is all about imagination. The work of the theologian is to help the community of believers to think clearly about how God is speaking to the community in the here and now. Magesa took Ila's question seriously. Hence, he insisted on a synodal church that embodies African notions of connectedness. He called for a reform of structures of authority in the church to allow for full participation by all its members. After all, baptism is what constitutes the foundations of ecclesial belonging and discernment. I want to make a bold statement here by inviting African theologians to take a critical look at the Eucharistic banquet African Christians participate in. The Eucharist at its core is God's solidarity with creation in the concreteness of their existence. Hence, God, who became one with creation, took the regular food that was accessible to the context in which he lived, Judea, and sacralized it as a symbol of God's solidarity with creation. Unfortunately, this basic motif of the Eucharist tends to be forgotten when Christians debate over the matter and substance of what constitutes bread and wine. Wheat and vine are not easily grown in Africa. Each time Africans celebrate the Eucharist in its current form, they instantiate a sense of alienation to their own context. Yet, the Eucharistic formula reminds the faithful that the bread and wine are fruits of their labor. What is the labor that African Christians are to offer to God when they bring bread and wine that are imported from Europe? The work of the theologian is to help the church to think outside of the restricted box that wants to maintain sameness. In Eastern Nigeria, for example, the ritual of kola nut breaking has more spiritual significance in the psyches of the people than their eating of the consecrated bread and wine. I argue that if one were to do a sociological study of the Rwandan genocide, one would conclude that the bond of Christian baptism and the Eucharistic meal could not address the historical hate that existed between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Perhaps African theologians ought to help Africans embrace deep-rooted links of sorority that can withstand structures of hate playing out in the continent. How then can the Eucharist be reimagined to make it authentically African? This is the task for the future of theology in the continent. Africa continues to suffer from economic exploitations and political dictatorships carried out by Africans whose interests align with those of Western exploiters. Colonial mentality is all about exploitation through the production of collective individualism. After all, the colonizer's basic interest is to exploit the colonized. Exploitation is by its nature rooted in an individualistic mindset. When the victims of colonialism are made to embrace the logic of colonial mentality, they become perpetrators of exploitation unless they do the needed work. Contemporary African theology cannot ignore the work of helping Africans to address the culture of corruption and individualism. Jesus Christ initiated an era and the possibility of a new humanity that is grounded in fellowship and the common good. The early followers of Christ were known for their sense of fellowship because of their ability to transcend the culture of corruption and individualism. Acts chapter 4, verses 32 to 35. So as noted by Ella, the reality that the church in Africa must address today is, and I quote, to redefine itself in the face of the social problems posed on all levels of African life, unquote. Again, he raises some pertinent questions that ought to be posed here as well as Magesa's attempt to address them. Ella asks, and I quote, how is the church to be the church of Christ in those countries where bloody tyrants celebrate countless murders, exterminating harmless, voiceless populations? How is the church to enter into solidarity with the lowliest, the most disinherited, following the footsteps of Christ himself, who died on the cross to testify to his love for human beings, his sisters and brothers, unquote. In response to these questions, Magesa insisted that the work of the church in Africa is to embody the courage of the vision of the Second Vatican Council. The work of the church in Africa is to continue the work of creative imagination as begun by that same council. Thus, African theology must be rooted in an embrace of diverse perspectives and the boldness to think, reflect upon, and challenge what has been accepted to allow for their relevance within the context of the continent and its people. So let me offer some concluding remarks. Bishop Michael Msonganzila of Musoma Diocese in Tanzania best articulates the life and ministry of Magesa as a theologian in the following words, and I quote, "Magesa kept asking Africans, and you Africans, who do you say that Jesus is?" Unquote. The role of the theologian is to insist that her audience continues the practice of discernment to allow for authentic awareness of self and mission in the world. The future of African theology ought to be grounded in a pneumatological turn to the plights of Africans. The continent is in need of new images and symbols of life that allow for all to experience abundant life. Structures and systems of erasure must be critiqued for what they are. They must also be abandoned even when they serve the purpose of control. Clericalism is one of those systems. Unhealthy subserviency that continues to define communal life both within and outside the church must be abandoned. Christianity is a religion of fellowship where all persons are validated, seen, and affirmed for who they are. At its best, it is a religion that transcends the narrow visions of judgment, while embracing the practice of suspension of judgment that is rooted in mercy and compassion. Magesa embodied this way of being a Christian. His insistence on being a theologian for all people, whether those who embody the markers of heteronormativity or queerness, the rich or the poor, the educated or the illiterate, and the young or the old, is how his legacy will be remembered. Magesa saw his role as a medium of God's enduring mercy and compassion for all. The future of theology in Africa ought to be conditioned by a way of being and doing things that can birth forth a new Africa, where the sacredness of life is centered in all things. Africa has suffered enough from systems of death. The continent continues to have the least life expectancy rate in the world. The continent cannot provide good health care for its people. The continent cannot provide food and the basic needs for its people, all thanks to the current structures of exploitation playing out. Theologians cannot ignore these realities if they are to help the Christian faith to flourish in the continent. Resentment among the younger generations is growing on the continent. Attacks against priests and religious continue to be the norm today. These are signs that the church is losing the attention of the people, or the people are seeing the church and its current institutions as hostile to their own well-being and flourishing. This is the moment of grace for the church in Africa. Rather than lament these ills playing out in the continent, theologians ought now embody the prophetic witness and be in solidarity with those who have been pushed to the peripheries of church and society. Good theology can help to address the endemic poverty playing out in different parts of the continent. Theology done with the mind, heart, and hands will be able to put food on the table. It will be able to insist that the rule of law ought to be the norm in the continent. It will be able to foster a sense of continental sisterhood. If theologians embrace this prophetic summon, they would have embraced as well the saturated hope in the new humanity in Christ that defined the work and life of Magesa. On that note, I thank you all for joining with me on this reflective encounter with the legacy of Magesa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Professor Aihiokhai.